About a month ago, I noticed this very interesting comment which I want to share with you because it served as a catalyst for this whole video. It essentially came from a Blackpiller who wanted to quit, but he said he needs to see some studies that can basically point out to him why the black pill is wrong. And this video, we're going to do just that. We're going to disprove the black pill and the red pill with science. Myth number one, good looking guys are getting all the girls. There's this idea in the black pill that chads are just slaying it with women. Average looking guys like me are getting something here and there, and then below average looking guys are getting nothing. They're all incels. But is this true? Is this supported by science? And the answer is definitely no. Well, they did a massive study where they looked at tens of thousands of men, and they compared people's body counts with their height and their weight. And this is what they found. So for height, extremely tall guys had an average body count of 12.3 sexual partners. Pretty good. But now let's compare that to a short guy who had an average body count of 9.4 sexual partners. So being tall gives you an advantage, but it's only a 30% advantage, which is not nearly as much as you've been led to believe. Now let's take a look at weight. So you know which category did the worst? It wasn't the fat guys, it was the underweight guys, which intuitively makes sense, what I've noticed from my experience, because I think girls look at guys for like 120 pounds, I'm like, oh, he's a twig, he's not a real man, he can't fuck the shit out of me, type of thing. So a guy who was in decent shape had an average body count of 11. Compare that to a guy who was obese, he had an average body count of 9.3. So yes, being in shape gives you an advantage. It's just not a massive advantage. Now to be fair, this study looked at men from 18 to 65. So I think guys in their 30s and 40s, for them, weight is gonna play way less of a role, right? Because you're already typically married at this point. A lot of people get fat when they're married. And I think for people who are like 18 to 25, weight will play more of a role. However, height does not change throughout your lifetime. And it seems that, unlike you've been led to believe, height does not play nearly as much of a role as the black pill wants you to think. Myth number two. 10% of men have 90% of the sex. This is something you hear in the manosphere all the time. It sounds like a real statistic, so it must be true, right? Well, the answer is no. This is heavily exaggerated. The real number is 20% of men have about 50 to 60% of the sex. And here's the real kicker that no one tells you. That number has stayed the same for the last several decades. So it's not like every year chads are hogging more and more of the girls. No, for a very long period of time, there's been a smaller amount of sexually promiscuous men, right, who have a lot of sex, and most men have been somewhat sexually conservative and either, have a few sexual partners to get married, and that's the real truth. Myth number three. Every year there's more and more virgins. In 2018, 27% of men had reported being incels. And this is sort of a half-truth. Yes, it is technically true, but it misses the big picture. So you can see this very scary looking chart over here. It's like, oh my God, pretty soon there's gonna be 90% virgins. But what it doesn't account is age. Look at this breakdown when we go by age demographic. So when we go age 18 to 20, yes, 50% of men were virgins. However, when we go age 22 and up, literally 4 years later, it was only 7.85%. When we go age 25 and up, it's less than 2%. And I think the real big thing here has much less to do with Chads and Stacy's and much more to do with marriage rates. People are getting married later in life. People are getting married less and later than they've ever had in US history. And because of that, people are having sex a little bit later in life. Myth number four, women are having more and more sex every year, but they're doing it with a smaller and smaller percentage of men. And honestly, this is one I used to believe back in the day, but it's not based on the science. What the data shows is that there's a small percentage of women, less than 5%, that has become more and more sexually active every year. But when you look at women as a whole, there's actually less sex being had now than there was 20 years ago. That means Generation X and Boomer women had more sexual partners than women today. Now let's take a look at the top 5% of the most promiscuous women. So we kind of see this. So that means the hoes of today are more sexually active than the hoes of 20 years ago. But when we look at men, the top 5% of the most sexually successful men, we see kind of like this. It goes up into 2000s, and around 2010 it starts going back down. That means the chads of today are actually having a little bit less sex than the chads over 10 years ago. But women as a whole, on average, are having a lot less sex now than they were 30 years ago. Myth number five, your facial attractiveness will determine your success in the dating marketplace. So this one is also a half-truth. When it comes to short-term dating, then there is definitely a correlation between your facial attractiveness and your short-term dating success. However, when they looked at long-term dating success, they found there to be no correlation between how pretty your face is and how successful you are with long-term dating. It seems that women, when they're talking about getting into a serious relationship, want something a little bit more than a pretty face. And this is directly supported by the street interviews we've done when we asked couples, like, hey, what made you choose your boyfriend? Not a single girl was like, oh, it's his face or whatever, it's his gonial angle. most girls were like, hey, it's his character, it's this and that. What the study found is that it is the inner characters that are most likely to determine a man's long-term dating success. And here are two other interesting factors. A guy's facial attractiveness actually had no correlation between how selective he was or what his standards were. You know what actually determined how picky a guy was? His perception of his attractiveness. And here's where things get really interesting. There was no correlation also in a different study between a guy's perception of his attractiveness, i.e. how good looking the guy thinks he is, and his actual attractiveness, how good looking women think that same guy is. So that means what a bunch of dudes on the internet think about your looks makes zero difference, because that doesn't map onto well at all to what women find attractive. And that's the difference between the male gaze and the female gaze. Myth number 6, biological determinism. This is the idea that your success with women, and to some extent your success in life, will be entirely determined by your genetics. But this is only half truth. Of course genetics matter, but according to research, they're only 50% of the picture. The other 50% is environmental factors, but even that is a little bit of an oversimplification. The real truth is that your desires, the things that turn you on and off, will be heavily influenced by specific situations that people find themselves in. For example, there's this saying that women like dangerous men, but that is only true for women who grow up in dangerous areas. Or there's this idea that women prefer extroverted men. Well, actually, women who are paranoid and afraid of diseases prefer introverted men more. And the great David Buss, who is a pioneer in this field, literally says this verbatim: evolutionary psychology forcefully rejects a genetic determinism stance and instead is organized around a crisply formulated interactionist framework that involves the role of the environment at every step of the causal process. All right, so as you can see, a lot of these black pill and even red pill talking points can be easily disproven with science. There's some outright lies and there's some half-truths. We're not saying that everyone's maliciously lying to you, although there might be a little bit of that. Most of it is just the blind leading the blind. I can promise you that most YouTubers don't take the time to look at primary research before talking about the dating marketplace or any of that. And I want you guys to be different, because I'm going to link every single study in the description. I want you guys to take a look at that before forming an educated opinion. Also, for the black pillars and red pillars, I want you guys to resist the urge to jump into extremes and saying, oh, I guess Alex is saying looks don't matter. I guess a fat Indian janitor can get a perfect 10. No one is saying that. Of course looks matter, of course height matter. They just don't matter nearly as much as you've been led to believe. And I'm going to read this comment, which I think perfectly personifies the ending to this video. 2 years ago I was Blackpill and used to hate watch your channel, then I followed your tips and got better. And yes, there's a lot of things that are within your control. Your social skills, your charisma, how attractive you think you are, your confidence, how much muscle you put on in the gym, all this stuff is within your control, and it can play a big, big role in how successful you are with women.